December 7th. 1941, a date seared into American consciousness, transformed the Pacific Ocean from a vast expanse of blue tranquility into a brutal theater of warfare. The smoke had barely cleared from Pearl Harbor's burning battleships when military strategists huddled in darkened rooms, their fingers tracing routes across maps dotted with tiny islands most Americans had never heard of. Admiral Chester William Nimitz stood before a wall-sized chart, his weathered hands clasping behind his back, as he studied the seemingly insignificant specks of land stretching from Hawaii to Japan's doorstep. These islands, he knew, would become stepping stones soaked in the blood of young men who had been farm boys and factory workers mere months earlier. The camera footage, recently uncovered from naval archives and documented extensively in the Pacific War Journal's Spring 1998 edition, captured what words never could. Grainy black-and-white frames showed landing craft cutting through choppy waters toward Alcatraz beaches on August 7, 1942. Marines crouched low, their faces masks of controlled terror beneath their helmets. The footage jerked violently as explosions erupted, sending plumes of sand and coral skyward. One young Marine, identified years later as Private First Class Robert Eugene Henderson from Nebraska, stared directly into the camera lens for 3 seconds, eternity in combat's eyes, reflecting something ancient and terrible that no 20-year-old should have witnessed. General Douglas MacArthur had initially opposed this strategy, preferring a direct thrust toward the Philippines, but the Joint Chiefs understood the mathematical reality. Japan had fortified thousands of islands across the Pacific. Attacking them all would require decades and cost millions of American lives. Instead, they would island hop, seizing strategic locations while bypassing heavily defended positions, leaving Japanese garrisons to wither without supplies or reinforcements. The plan possessed brutal elegance, but its execution demanded sacrifice measured in destroyed vessels and shattered bodies. The unseen footage revealed the meticulous preparation preceding each assault. Aboard the USS Pennsylvania, sailors loaded shell after shell into massive 16-inch guns. The cameramen captured their synchronized movements, a deadly ballet rehearsed until muscle memory replaced conscious thought. Below deck, Marines sharpened bayonets and wrote letters they hoped wouldn't become their last words. Chaplains moved among them, offering quiet prayers and forced smiles. The footage showed one chaplain, Father Timothy O'Brien from Boston, placing his hand on a young Marine's shoulder. The Marine's lips moved silently, perhaps reciting the Lord's Prayer, perhaps simply saying his mother's name. Intelligence officers pored over reconnaissance photographs, identifying machine gun nests and artillery positions on islands whose names became synonymous with hell: Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliui, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Each photograph represented countless hours of dangerous flights by Navy pilots who skimmed treetops while Japanese fighters pursued them through clouded skies. The recovered footage included cockpit camera recordings from these missions, showing pilots banking sharply as tracer rounds streaked past their canopies, their breathing audible over the engine's roar, rapid, shallow gasps of men dancing with death at 300 miles per hour. November 20th, 1943 dawned clear and hot over Badillo Island in the Tarawa Atoll, where Japanese Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki had boasted that 1 million men couldn't take his fortress in 100 years. The newly discovered footage, analyzed by military historians at the Naval War College and referenced in their comprehensive report published in 2003, showed the pre-invasion bombardment transforming the tiny island into a landscape of fire and steel. Battleships and cruisers unleashed such fury that observers believed nothing could survive, yet beneath reinforced concrete bunkers. 4,500 Japanese soldiers waited with their weapons and their conviction that death was preferable to surrender. The landing craft approached Baguio's beaches across a coral reef that intelligence had catastrophically misjudged. The tide was too low. The footage captured the moment Marines realized their Higgins boats couldn't cross the reef. They would wade 700 yards through chest-deep water while Japanese machine gunners enjoyed perfect firing conditions. Major General Julian Culp Smith watched from the command ship through binoculars, his jaw clenched so tightly that aides later reported seeing blood where his teeth had cut into his lower lip. He couldn't recall the assault. The men were committed, and they would either take the beach or die trying. Combat cameraman Sergeant Norman Thomas Hatch, whose Medal of Honor recommendation cited his extraordinary courage under fire, captured footage that remained classified for decades because officials feared it would shatter American morale. His camera recorded Marines falling in the water, their blood spreading in dark clouds as waves carried their booty toward shore. Other Marines pushed forward, stepping over their dead comrades, their rifles held high to keep them dry. Some men weighted down by equipment simply disappeared beneath the surface. The footage showed one Marine stopping to help a wounded comrade, then both men vanishing as a mortar round struck directly between them. The explosion sent a geyser of water 20 feet high, and when it cleared, only ripples remained. On the beach, the surviving Marines found themselves pinned against a seawall made of coconut logs, unable to advance but refusing to retreat. The Japanese had constructed an interlocking network of pillboxes that provided overlapping fields of fire. Every approach was covered. Every movement drew gunfire. The footage showed Lieutenant William Dean Hawkins, already wounded twice, leading a demolition team against a concrete bunker. They crawled through, sand churned by explosions, dragging satchel charges and flamethrowers. Hawkins reached the bunker's entrance, pulled the pin on a grenade, and tossed it inside. The explosion was followed by screams, then silence. Hawkins turned toward his men, gestured for them to follow, and fell. A sniper's bullet had found him. He died hours later, earning the Medal of Honor posthumously. The battle for Beccio lasted 76 hours. The newly released footage documented every phase: the desperate night fighting when Japanese counterattacks crashed against Marine positions, the flamethrower teams methodically burning out bunkers, the final moments when surviving Japanese soldiers charged American lines in suicidal banzai attacks rather than accept defeat. One sequence showed a Japanese officer's sword raised high, leading 20 men directly into concentrated machine gun fire. They fell like wheat before a scythe, their bodies piling atop one another until the firing stopped, and silence descended, a silence somehow more terrible than the gunfire. June 19, 1944, marked one of the Pacific War's most decisive naval engagements. Though the footage recovered from carrier-based aircraft revealed a battle far more chaotic than official reports suggested. Vice Admiral Mark Andrew Mitcher commanded Task Force 58, a massive collection of 15 aircraft carriers, 7 battleships, and dozens of cruisers, destroyers. His opponent, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, led the Japanese First Mobile Fleet toward the Mariana Islands, hoping to destroy the American carrier force in one decisive engagement. The Japanese called it Operation Ago. American pilots would remember it as the Marianas Turkey Shoot. The gun camera footage from Hellcat fighters preserved and temperature-controlled Navy archives and examined extensively in Samuel Eliot Morrison's definitive 15-volume History of United States Naval Operations in World War II showed Japanese aircraft falling from the sky in numbers that seemed impossible. American pilots had trained for thousands of hours to their aircraft. Featured superior technology, including better radios, radar, and self-sealing fuel tanks. The Japanese, by contrast, had lost most of their experienced pilots in previous battles and sent inexperienced replacements, flying obsolete aircraft into combat against veterans who had survived campaigns from Guadalcanal to the Gilberts. Commander David McCampbell, who would become the Navy's top ace with 34 confirmed kills, flew his Grumman F-6F Hellcat into a formation of Japanese bombers approaching the American fleet. His gun camera captured the moment his bullets tore into a Yokozuka D4Y, Judy Dive B. Amber. The aircraft's wings separated and it spiraled downward, trailing smoke. McCampbell immediately acquired another Target torpedo bomber, flying so low its propeller almost touched the wave tops. His burst of 50 caliber machine gun fire walked across the fuselage, and the bomber cartwheeled into the ocean, disintegrating on impact. Within minutes, McCampbell had downed 5 enemy aircraft, and the day was far from over. The footage also captured the tragedy inherent in all combat. One sequence showed a damaged Japanese Zero fighter attempting to return to its carrier, trailing smoke from its engine. The pilot nursed his dying aircraft across miles of empty ocean, likely thinking of family waiting at home, likely praying to reach the carrier deck just one more time. American fighters intercepted him, miles from his destination. The gun camera recorded the Zero breaking apart under sustained fire, the pilot's body briefly visible before plummeting into the sea. You become one of 315? Japanese pilots killed that daemon whose names were known to their mothers and sisters. Men who had written poetry and loved cherry blossoms and believed they fought for something worthy of their sacrifice. Below the aerial combat, American submarines prowled Japanese fleet positions. The recovered periscope footage showed the USS Albacore achieving a perfect firing solution on the carrier Taiho, Admiral Ozawa's flagship. The submarine's commander, Lieutenant Commander James William Blanchard, watched through his periscope as the torpedo track ran true. The explosion sent a shudder through the massive carrier, but Taiho appeared to absorb the damage. Crew damage control teams believed they had contained the flooding. They were catastrophically wrong. Aviation fuel vapors had spread throughout the ship. Hours later, a single spark triggered an explosion that tore Taiho apart. The carrier sank, taking 1,600 men with her. September 15, 1944, brought Marines of the 1st Division to Peleliu's shores, where they would fight the most brutal, and many historians argue, most unnecessary battle of the Pacific Campaign. Major General William Henry Rupertus had promised his men the island would fall in for days. The footage recovered from Marine combat cameramen analyzed and detailed by military historian John Hoffman in his 2001 work, Chesty. The story of Lieutenant General Lewis B. Puller documented 73 days of savage fighting through terrain that seemed designed by a malevolent god specifically to maximize casualties. The pre-invasion bombardment had been the most intensive yet delivered. In the Pacific Theater, 3 days of continuous shelling that consumed thousands of tons of explosives. Observers aboard the bombarding ships believed nothing could survive. The footage showed Peleliu's vegetation stripped away, the island's surface transformed into a moonscape of overlapping craters. Naval officers assured ground commanders that Japanese defenses had been neutralized. They were catastrophically, tragically wrong. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa had anticipated the bombardment and withdrawn his 11,000 defenders into limestone caves and reinforced tunnels beneath the island's central ridge system. They had survived unscathed, and they waited. The landing beach footage captured Marines emerging from their Amtraks into what appeared to be a quiet, conquered island. Then the Japanese opened fire. Hidden machine guns swept the beach with interlocking fire. Mortar launched from concealed positions rained shells onto the exposed Marines. Artillery pieces firing from caves destroyed landing craft in the Shaw. Low water. The footage showed men falling, crawling, running, dying, all within minutes of stepping onto Peleliu's white coral sand. One haunting sequence captured a Marine medic, Hospital Corpsman Second Cass Robert Eugene Bush, running toward wounded men while bullets kicked up coral dust around his feet. Bush reached a wounded Marine, began applying a bandage, and both men disappeared as a mortar shell impacted directly on their position. Bush would survive and receive the Medal of Honor. The Marine he tried to save did not. The Emerbergal Ridge system, which Marines grimly nicknamed Bloody Nose Ridge, became a killing ground unlike anything experienced in the Pacific War. The recovered footage showed Marines advancing through coral ravines barely wide enough for 2 men to pass. Japanese soldiers fired from caves invisible until Marines were within feet of the openings. Flamethrower teams would burn out one position, only to receive fire from another opening, 50 feet away. Caves interconnected through tunnels carved deep into the limestone. One particularly disturbing sequence showed Marines using a flamethrower on a cave entrance. The flames illuminated soldiers deeper in the cave, their silhouettes visible as they prepared to fire. The flames reached them, and their screams echoed through the camera's audio equipment, a sound the cameraman reportedly heard in nightmares for decades afterward. Captain Everett Pope led Company C of the 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, in an assault on an unnamed hill that cost his company almost every man. The footage captured the moment Pope's men reached the summit after 6 hours of fighting uphill through machine gun and mortar fire. They had expended all their ammunition. Japanese soldiers surrounded them as darkness fell. Pope's men threw rocks and empty rifles at attacking Japanese soldiers, fought with knives and fists, and somehow held their position through the night. At dawn, only 9 men remained unwounded of Pope's original company of 235. He received the Medal of Honor, though he later said he would trade the medal to bring back just one of his men. February 19, 1945 arrived with 3 Marine divisions approaching Iwo Jima. a volcanic island whose strategic importance was exceeded only by its defensive strength. The footage preserved by Marine combat cameramen and Navy photographers, ostensibly Revi, Ude and Richard Wheeler's 1975 account Iwo, captured one of warfare's most iconic images: 6 men raising an American flag atop Mount Suribachi. But the newly discovered footage revealed the broader context of suffering that surrounded that single moment of triumph. The island measured only 8 square miles, yet Lieutenant General Tadomichi Kuribayashi had transformed it into a fortress defended by 21,000. Japanese soldiers occupying 11 miles of tunnels, 1,500 blockhouses, and countless hidden artillery positions. Kuribayashi had studied American tactics and abandoned the traditional Japanese strategy of defending at the water's edge. Instead, he ordered his men to construct fences throughout the island's interior, particularly around its 2 airfields and volcanic highlands. His orders were explicit: each man must kill 10 Americans before dying himself. There would be no suicidal banzai charges, no wasted attacks, only patient, methodical killing of American Marines until the last Japanese soldier fell. The landing footage showed 70,000 Marines coming ashore across beaches of volcanic ash, so loose that men sank to their ankles with each step. The beach appeared quiet. Marines climbed off their landing craft, formed into units, and began moving inland. Then Kuribayashi's artillery opened fire. The footage captured the beach transforming into an inferno. Shells impacted among tightly packed Marines with devastating effect. One explosion killed or wounded an entire platoon, 40 men destroyed in an instant. Landing craft attempting to withdraw burned at the water's edge. Wounded men crawled through volcanic sand trying to reach aid stations. The audio recording preserved the screams, the explosions, the officers shouting orders that couldn't be heard above the chaos. Sergeant Michael Strank led his squad toward Mount Suribachi through 4 days of continuous combat. The newly discovered footage showed Strank repeatedly exposing himself to enemy fire to direct his men to covered positions, throwing grenades into Japanese positions, and encouraging exhausted Marines to keep moving forward. On February 23rd, he and 5 other Marines, including Corporal Harlan Block, Private First Class Franklin Sousley, Private First Class Rene Gagnon, Private First Class IRA Hayes, and Hospital Corpsman Second, D-Class John Bradley ascended Suribachi carrying a larger replacement flag. Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal captured their flag raising in a photograph that would become the most reproduced image in photographic history. But the combat footage showed what the famous photograph did not. For days later, Strank, Block, and Sousley would all be killed by artillery fire. They never knew their image had traveled around the world, that their names would be remembered when so many others were forgotten. The battle for Iwo Jima's interior consumed 36 days and cost 26,000 American casualties, including 6,900 dead. The footage documented Marines advancing yard by yard through terrain that provided no natural cover. Japanese soldiers fired from camouflaged positions until Marines were within grenade range, then withdrew through tunnels to fire again from different positions. Flamethrower teams and demolition squads methodically sealed caves and bunkers, often at terrible cost. One sequence showed a flamethrower operator approaching a cave entrance when rifle fire from an unseen position hit his fuel tanks. He transformed into a human torch, stumbling backward while his teammates tried desperately to reach him. The flames consumed him in seconds. April 1st, 1945 Easter Sunday and April Fool's Day saw the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War as one. 180,000 American soldiers and Marines landed on Okinawa, the final stepping stone before Japan itself. The footage captured by Navy photographers aboard ships of the Fifth Fleet documented comprehensively. In George Pfeiffer's 2001 work Tennosun, the Battle of Okinawa and the Atomic Bomb revealed a campaign dominated not by ground combat but by a new and terrifying tactic. Kamikaze attacks that transformed Japanese pilots into guided missiles willing to die if they could take American sailors with them. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner commanded the amphibious force from his flagship, watching through binoculars as the first waves of Marines and soldiers reached Okinawa's beaches unopposed. The lack of resistance confused American commanders. Where were the Japanese? As Lieutenant General Matsuru Oshijima had withdrawn his 110,000 defend. urged to prepared positions in Okinawa's southern highlands, particularly around Shuri Castle. He would make the Americans pay for every yard in blood, and while they fought on land, Japan's remaining aircraft would attack the fleet offshore in suicidal waves that would test American sailors' courage beyond any previous measure. The kamikaze footage captured attacks that defied belief. Gun cameras aboard battleships, cruisers, and destroyers recorded Japanese aircraft diving through walls of anti-aircraft fire toward their targets. Some disintegrated before reaching their objectives, blown apart by 5-inch shells or shredded by 40mm and 20mm cannons. But others pressed through, their pilots visible in cockpits as they aimed their aircraft at American vessels, bridges, and flight decks. One sequence showed a Zero fighter diving toward the destroyer USS Laffey on April 16th. The ship's gunners hit the aircraft repeatedly, pieces tearing away from wings and fuselage. Yet the Zero continued its dive and crashed into the ship's aft section. The explosion killed 32 sailors instantly and wounded dozens more. But Laffey survived barely after enduring 6 kamikaze hits and 4 bomb strikes during 80 minutes of continuous attack. The destroyer USS Bunker Hill suffered the war's most devastating kamikaze attack on May 11th, when 2 aircraft struck the carrier within minutes. The footage captured the first Zero crashing through the flight deck, while the second followed immediately, bombs detonating among aircraft being refueled and rearmed. Aviation gasoline ignited, creating an inferno that consumed the carrier's stern. Sailors fought fires in temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Men jumped overboard to escape the flames. Others remained at their stations, directing firefighting efforts, even as their clothing burned. The footage showed one officer identified later as Lieutenant Commander Joseph Francis Carmichael, organizing hose teams while his hair and uniform smoldered. 393 men died aboard Bunker Hill, but Carmichael's leadership saved the ship from sinking. He received the Navy Cross posthumously. He died from burns 3 days after the attack. The ground campaign produced equally horrifying footage. Marines and Army soldiers fought through rain and mud against Japanese defenders, who fought from caves and fortified positions around Shuri Castle. The newly discovered footage showed flamethrower and demolition teams working in coordination. Marines would suppress a position with rifle fire while the flamethrower operator advanced, then burn the position while demolition men moved forward. With satchel charges to seal the cave permanently. One sequence showed this process going catastrophically wrong when Japanese soldiers emerged from a hidden tunnel behind the American team. The ambush killed 4 Marines before reinforcements arrived. The Japanese defenders fought until killed surrender remained almost unknown among Japanese forces on Okinawa. June 21, 1945 marked the official end of organized Japanese resistance on Okinawa. Though the newly recovered footage documented fighting that continued for days afterward as American forces hunted down soldiers hiding in caves and civilians who had been convinced by Japanese propaganda that Americans would torture and murder them. The campaign had cost 12,000 American dead and 38,000 wounded casualties, exceeding any previous Pacific battle. The Japanese had suffered catastrophically worse, 110,000 soldiers killed, along with between 40,000 and 150,000 Okinawan civilians caught in the crossfire. The civilian footage proved most disturbing. Combat cameramen documented Okinawan families hiding in caves, terrified of both Japanese soldiers who threatened to kill them if they surrendered and American forces they had been taught were monsters. One particularly heartbreaking sequence showed Marines coaxing a family, 2 parents and 3 children, from a cave using an interpreter. The father emerged first, hands raised, body shaking with fear. Marines. The naval casualties offshore continued until the campaign's final days. Kamikaze attacks sank 36 American ships and damaged 368 more. 5,000 sailors died more than the Marines who died taking Iwo Jima. The footage from damaged vessels showed catastrophic destruction. The destroyer USS Callahan's bridge camera captured the ship's final moments on July 29th when a kamikaze struck amidships. He destroyer's back, and she sank within minutes. 47 sailors died. The destroyer USS Pritchett, struck by 3 kamikazes on different occasions, somehow survived all 3 attacks. The footage showed her crew fighting fires, plugging holes, and maintaining their stations despite taking casualties that would have broken less determined men. Admiral Chester Nimitz toured Okinawa after the battle's conclusion. The footage captured his reaction to the devastation. The admiral, normally stoic, visibly struggled with emotion as he walked past the graves of thousands of young Americans who would never return home. He understood what Okinawa's cost implied. If defending this single island had required such sacrifice, would invading Japan itself demand? Military planners estimated Operation Downfall. The proposed invasion of Japan's home islands would cost 1 million American casualties. The footage showed Nimitz standing before rows of white crosses, his hands clasped behind his back, his shoulders sagging under the weight of decisions only he could make. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan intensified during summer of 1945. The newly discovered footage from B-29 bomber cameras documented missions flown from captured airfields on Tinian and Saipan. Hundreds of superfortresses flew at night, their bellies full of incendiary bombs designed to ignite Japan's cities. Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe all burned. The footage captured firestorms visible from 20,000 feet, entire urban districts consumed in flames that generated winds strong to flip over cars and tear people from their feet. Conservative estimates suggested these raids killed 300,000 Japanese civilians and left millions homeless. The footage documented a policy of total war taken to its logical extreme. If Japan's military wouldn't surrender, then Japan's cities would burn until surrender became the only option. August 6, 1945 arrived, clear and hot over Hiroshima. The B-29 bomber Enola Gay carried a single bomba uranium weapon nicknamed Little Boy that would forever change warfare's nature. The tailgunner's camera captured the moment the bomb detonated 1,900 feet above the city's center. A flash brighter than 1,000 suns, then a mushroom cloud rising into the stratosphere, then nothing but smoke and fire where 350,000 people had lived hours earlier. President Harry S. Truman announced the bombing from Washington, explaining that the United States possessed a weapon that could destroy entire cities and would continue using it until Japan surrendered unconditionally. The footage from Hiroshima arrived later, shot by Japanese cameramen, and captured American medical teams. Nothing in the Pacific War's previous battles prepared observers for the devastation. The blast and subsequent firestorm had leveled everything within 2 miles of ground zero. Bodies lay everywhere, carbonized by heat so intense it had melted glass and concrete. Survivors wandered through ruins, their clothing burned away, their skin hewn. In strips, many already doomed by radiation poisoning, though they didn't yet understand what radiation meant. One sequence showed a mother sitting beside her dead child, rocking slowly back and forth, her lips moving in what might have been a lullaby or a prayer. The cameraman continued filming until an American medical officer ordered him to stop. Some suffering was too immense to document. 3 days later, on August 9th, the bomber boxcar dropped a plutonium weapon nicknamed Fat Man on Nagasaki after clouds obscured the primary target of Kakura. The explosion killed 70,000 people instantly and injured another 70,000. The footage from Nagasaki mirrored Hiroshima's horror: flattened buildings, burned bodies, survivors begging for water that medical personnel couldn't safely provide because drinking water would kill them faster. The mushroom cloud rose 35,000 feet, visible from Kyushu's southern tip 60 miles away. Emperor Hirohito addressed his people on August 15th via radio, the first time most Japanese citizens had heard their emperor's voice. The newly discovered footage showed Japanese soldiers and civilians listening to the broadcast, many weeping as Hirohito announced Japan's acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration's terms. Japan would surrender unconditionally. War was over. The footage captured contrasting reactions. American sailors aboard the USS Missouri celebrating, dancing, embracing, weeping with relief. Japanese soldiers on bypassed Pacific islands learning their emperor had capitulated and choosing mass suicide rather than accept defeat. American prisoners of war in Japanese camps, hearing rumors of freedom, but not daring to believe until they saw. American aircraft dropping supplies and medical personnel. September 2, 1945 brought the formal surrender ceremony aboard the USS Missouri anchored in Tokyo Bay. The recovered footage documented every moment. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu signing the surrender documents. General Douglas MacArthur, accepting Japan's capitulation. Admiral Chester Nimitz, and representatives from allied nations adding their signatures. MacArthur's voice, recorded clearly on audio equipment, declared, "It is my earnest hope, indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past." Standing beside MacArthur were two generals who had been imprisoned by the Japanese emaciated men who had survived years of brutal captivity and now witnessed their tormentors' defeat. The island-hopping campaign had succeeded beyond strategic expectations, but at costs measured in destroyed cities and shattered lives. The footage documented not just military operations, but humanity's capacity for both heroism and horror. Marines who fought through jungles and volcanic ash, sailors who endured kamikaze attacks and typhoons, airmen who flew missions knowing each takeoff might be their last. Japanese soldiers who fought with courage for a cause ultimately doomed all were captured by cameras that recorded warfare's reality. Without propaganda's polish, the strategic concept of bypassing fortified positions while seizing key objectives had worked, shortening the war and saving lives compared to the alternative of assaulting every fortified position. Yet the campaign's final months witnessed weapons that threatened to make conventional warfare obsolete. The atomic bombs had ended one war, but immediately raised questions about the next. In a world where cities could be destroyed in seconds, what would future conflicts look like? The footage ends with American soldiers and Marines boarding ships for home. They carry duffel bags and weapons, but more importantly, they carry memories of friends who died on unnamed beaches, of battles fought in conditions beyond civilian comprehension, of a war that had transformed them from boys into men who understood death's permanence and peace's fragility. The cameras captured their faces, some smiling, some crying, some staring in. Oh, the distance had nothing visible to anyone else. These were the men who had won the Pacific War through courage, sacrifice, and determination. The footage preserved their service for generations who would live in the peace these men purchased with blood on. Beaches whose names, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa would forever represent both war's horror and humanity's capacity for courage in history's darkest moments.